Hello dears, how are you? Today we are going to take like a quick revision on business failure lectures to have a look on the practical example for this chapter. So let's get started. Business failure can be viewed in a number of ways and can result from one or more causes. So there are a lot of causes for business failure. There are a lot of ways also for business. What about the types of business failure? The firm may fail because its returns are negative or low. So, if the firm fails to earn a return that is greater than its cost of capital, it can be viewed as having failed. So, if we have an issue between the return and cost, and the cost is higher than the return, this means that we are going to fail. What about the second type of failure? Second type of failure is about the insolvency, which occurs when a firm is unable to pay its liabilities. This firm have a huge number of liabilities. Okay, so when the firm is insolvent, this means its assets are still greater than its liabilities. What about bankruptcy? Bankruptcy occurs when the stated value of the firm's liabilities exceeds the fair value of its assets, which means that the liabilities have a huge number or a huge value. So the bankrupt firm has a negative stockholders' equity. What about the major causes of business failure? The primary cause of business failure is the mismanagement, which accounts for more than 50% of all cases. So if we have a strong management, we cannot have a business failure. But if we have a weak management, this means that we are going to fail because the mismanagement is the most primary cause of the business failure for each company. What about the voluntary settlements? This happened when a firm becomes insolvent or bankrupted, so it may arrange with its creditors voluntary settlement. What about this settlement? This settlement is normally intended by the debtor of the firm because such an arrangement may enable it to continue or not. So we have to talk about, or we have to talk with our debtors. We have to talk about our stockholders. We have to make a settlement. Okay? So what about the three major types? The three major types of the corporate failure that could easily identified, namely by what? Namely by the corporate body with low or negative return. This is the first case. The second case with the technically insolvent, which means that the company is insolvent for some reasons. So, or a corporate body that is bankrupted, like we have taken before. So what about causes and effect of corporate failure? Corporate failure could be caused by a number of factors. Those factors such as managerial inefficiency, which is the main or primary cause of the ineffectiveness of each company or of the failure of each company. So we have also cultural factors and economic instability and public policy, and we have studied this before in more details. So what about the possible effects of the corporate failure? So possible effects can be like the increase in the level of unemployment. If we have a corporate failure, this will mean that we have a level of unemployment, decreasing standard of living, underutilization of resources, increasing crime level, and so on. What about the corporate failure prediction models? We have models that can predict that our corporation is going to fail. So this is our issue today. We want to make such an example or a practical example which can predict this company or this corporation will fail or not. So the corporate failure models can be divided into two groups: quantitative models and qualitative models. What about the quantitative models? The quantitative models are based largely on the published financial information, but the qualitative models are based on the internal assessment of the company. So I need a model to predict whether this corporation will fail or not. Okay, so what about the quantitative? The quantitative, if I prefer the quantitative model, then I will base on the published financial information. So what about the qualitative model? I will base on the internal assessment of the company concerned. So both types to identify the characteristics, whether financial or not financial. Okay, so we have something called Z-score. That score can predict for us this corporation will fail or not. This corporation have a poor management or not. This corporation has a future to 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 um to be completed its issues in the future or not. It will be closed or not, and something like that. So what about the score indicates? How I can indicate the score from the Z score? How I can predict failure from the Z score? We will solve the practical example. And after solving, if we found the number that less than 1.81, this means that the companies with the Z score below than 1.81 means that these companies or this corporation in danger and can be bankrupted corporations. So any number or any result came from Z score below than 1.81. This means this corporation is in a danger level, okay? What if the Z score is between 1.81 and 2.99? This means that the companies need further investigation, so it may fail or not. It depends on its management. It depends on how to face this failure before it's happened, okay? So what about if the Z score is 3 or above? This means that those companies are financially sound, so it's okay. It's have a level of stability, or it can be financially sound. So we are going today to solve the practical example which about the Z score, which we will analyze the results that comes from this Z score, and we will predict failure of corporation or not, depending on those standards or depending on those numbers. If the number is below 1.81, this means that we are in danger. If the score is between 1.81 and 2.99, this means that we have further investigation, so we can rescue this corporation from danger, or we can rescue it from failure. So what about it's 3 or above? This means that we are in financially sound, that it's okay. So we have a level of stability or something like that. So what about the practical example and how to solve? Let's take an example. If I'm going to calculate the Z score is generated by calculating 5 ratios. So I need to calculate 5 ratios to predict the failure of this company, or to predict the failure of this corporation. So what about the Z score equation? Z score equal 1.2x1 plus 1.4x2 plus 3.3x3 plus 0.6x4 plus 1 or plus x5 directly. So here this equation should be memorized. It will not be given in the final. So you should memorize this equation in order to write it down in your final paper and then substitute with the numbers of the example. So the score equal 1.2x1 plus 1.4x2 plus 3.3x3 plus 0.6x4 plus x5. What do we mean by x1, x2, x3, and x4, x5? What do we mean by these abbreviations, or what this stands for? X1 stands for the working capital over total assets. I want to take the working capital of the company and then divide it over the total assets to get the value of X1. So what about X2? X2 about the return earnings over total assets. So what about X3? X3 is about earnings before interest and tax over total assets. What about X4? X4 is about the market value of equity over total liabilities. What about X5? X5 is about sales over total assets. So here I should memorize the Z-score equation, and I also should memorize that each x1, 2, 3, and 4 and 5 stands for what. So it's like a rule, or they are like rules that I should memorize to put it in the final and then substitute with the numbers of the example. So let's take an example and we will go back to this slide. And we will go back to this slide to know more about, if I cannot memorize right now about this score x1, x2, x3, and x4 and so on, I'm going to solve the next example so it will be clear more than this slide. So what about the next slide? From the APC company records, we have the following information. I have current assets, I have long-term assets, I have current liabilities, I have long-term liabilities, I have owner's equity, I have revenues, which come from sales, and I have expenses. If you remember, current assets plus long-term assets, I will get the total assets. Current liabilities plus long-term liabilities, I will get also the total liabilities. And those are the numbers, which is in LE bounds. So here, those are the givens of the example. So, other data, if we have owner's equity, and owner's equity consists of common stock, 25 shares, 10 per share, and return earnings, 1,250. The market value of share equal 19.5. And the expenses for the period include interest, which is 100, and tax expenses 10%. What is the requirements of this example? Based on that score calculation, predicts the failure of this corporation and give your opinion. So I need to put the Z score equation, and I should substitute by x1, x3, x2, x3, x4, and x5 by the numbers that after I will calculate to predict whether we have failure or not. Okay, so the solution, if I'm going to calculate the Z score, I need to put the equation at first. Z equal 1.2x1 plus 1.4x2 plus 3.3x3 plus 0.6x4 plus x5. So I'm going to solve x1. x1 equal what? x1 equal working capital over total assets. Working capital over total assets. If you go back to the example, you cannot find working capital. Working capital is not given. So how to calculate the working capital? Working capital equal current assets minus current liabilities. If you subtract the current liabilities from the current assets, you will get the working capital. And if you divide working capital over total assets, you will get the value of x1. So we can take the numbers from the givens of the example. Current assets equal 3,200 minus current liabilities, which equals 2,000, over total assets, which equal 5,000, to get 0.25. So what about x2? x2 equals the return earnings over total assets, and those numbers are already given in the example from the other data, and from the total assets I can put the current assets plus the long-term assets. So x2 can be 1,250 over 5,000, which is about the total assets. to get 0.25. So the value of x1, 0.25. The value of x2, also 0.25. So after I'm getting the value of x3 and the value of x4, value of x5, I can substitute in the z-score equation. Okay, so how to calculate x3, how to calculate x4, how to calculate x5. X3 is about earnings before interest and tax. Just note this: earnings before interest and tax over total assets. So if you remember, when we illustrated in the lecture on board, we can subtract interest and we can calculate tax from the example, and we can get this information from the other data, which is about the paragraph, which is include tax or not, include interest or not, and from the givens. So how to calculate earnings before interest and tax? I should put 1,250 minus 800 plus 100 plus 50. This is because those earnings are before interest and tax. I should exclude interest and tax from the calculations of earnings. And it will be also over the total assets, which is equal 0.12. Okay? If you want to know 50, from where we get 50, because 1,250, 800, 100, all of those numbers are givens. But what about 50? How to calculate 50? 50 is the tax expenses. Tax expenses equal the net income over 1 minus the percentage of tax. And also it's already given. So if I get the net income, which is 450 over okay, before that, how to calculate the net income? If you remember how to make an income statement, how will you calculate the profit or loss? I can take all revenues and subtract from it all expenses to know whether I have net income or net loss. So if you get the revenues and you subtract from the revenues the expenses, you will get 450. Those 450 should be divided on 1 minus the percentage times the percentage, which is already given. So we can get 50. So what about X4? X4 is equal the market value of equity over total liabilities. Okay, how to calculate the market value of equity? Market value of equity will equal the number of shares times market price per share. So if you multiply the number of shares times the market price per share, you will get the market value of equity. If you divided it over total liabilities, you can get X4. So the number of X4 will be 25 times 19.5 over 3,250. 3,250. So it will equal 0.15. So what about X5? How to calculate X5? X5 will equal sales over total assets. What about sales? Sales, which is revenues, which are revenues, by the way. So the number is already given, 1,250 over the number of total assets, which is 5,000. So it will equal it equals 0.25. So I need to put the z-score equation to substitute with these numbers that I have already calculated. So that equal 1.x1, 1.2x1, 1.4x2, 3.3x3 plus 0.6x4 plus x5. And from my solution, I can get the values of x1, x2, x3, x4, and x5. So I will put 1.2 times 0.25 plus 1.4 times 0.25 plus 3.3 between brackets 0.12 plus 0.6 between brackets 0.15 plus 0.25. So if you calculate it over on your calculator, you can get the z equal 1.386. Okay, I make all of these calculations to predict whether this corporation will fail or not, will have a corporate failure or not. So that equal 1.386, which means what? which means that the debt value is less than 1.88, and this means that we are in danger, that this company or this corporation is going to fail or is going to face the bankruptcy. But if the Z value were between 1.88 and 2.99, this means that we need further investigation to avoid bankruptcy. We can help this corporation to avoid the corporation failure. But here we are in the danger stage. So I hope that you can revise this chapter well with a practical example. And if you have any question, feel free to ask. Okay. And that's it for today. Thank you and goodbye.